Cybersecurity and cyber liability to me are two complementary solutions of the same problem. One's transferring risk, one's mitigating it, but it all has to do with cyber risk.
I think that any agency that's listening to this right now, if all you did was think about the types of accounts that are in your book of business and the type of information that they have and what could happen if they were to get compromised as a result of something that you did, how bad would that screw things up?
First questions I'd ask is, what is your largest area of risk and how did you come to understand that? Because that's going to start to unpack a lot of things. Next, I want to start to ask about the decisions that they've made to address those. What best practices are you following? Are you making this up on your own, or do you have something that's guiding you through this? And then, understanding too how they're prepared for an incident. With agencies, I think the data, they're probably one of the industries where, because of the reputation, the relationship-based nature of insurance, they're probably more worried about than others. And a lot of other businesses, they're not too worried about that data getting out. That's not affecting them directly as much as other impacts like losing a partner, projects going down, their business being stalled while they're under attack. All of those kinds of things tend to move the needle more.
That teachers are underpaid, yet they largely remain underpaid everywhere in the country. That just blows my mind. They're the backbone of everything we do. If you don't have teachers, you really don't have much of anything else.
Whenever I do my discovery calls, I break it into three key areas: your understanding risks, your best practices, and that incident response piece. Kind of a fourth area, I guess, that would be really important to include there would be compliance. And so that's a big one that really can help push your deal forward a little bit more too, because you might have requirements that are driving the timeline here.
If you start going in and talking to a middle market company about a cyber incident response plan, probably 50% of the time, you're going to find they don't even have one.
When you can identify other initiatives, that's going to be really important to connect the dots to them. Because if all you're doing is talking to these executives about cyber risk and avoiding attacks, and you don't have the ability to hitch the value in your solution to these other initiatives and priorities that they have, they're going to walk back out of that room with the same thing that was on their mind before they walked in.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Power Producers Podcast, where we are refining and redefining the sales game. And if you have listened to this podcast for any period of time, you know how serious we are about cyber, period. And I say cyber because I don't want to talk about cybersecurity or cyber insurance. I'm talking about all of the above and anything else that falls under that category. As a result, I reached out to Ryan Smith on LinkedIn. He is the founder of RLS Consulting, and he lives in that space, but not as an insurance agent. So I love getting the perspectives of people who are professionals in the areas we want to focus so that we know better what's going on in those areas instead of making assumptions based on internet research. So that being said, what's up, man? I'm glad you were able to join us for a little bit today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I've been following you for quite some time now and watch a lot of your stuff. I've been brushing up on some of your other cybersecurity podcasts that you've done over the last year, and excited to contribute to the conversation there.
Yeah, it's been a little while, man. I've had a couple MSPs on that are friends of mine in the past, but we haven't really, and then other than that, it's always been, the people from Pro Writers, or we had Michael Phillips on from CFC. It's always from the insurance side of things. But, when we engage in the marketplace, we engage from a risk management perspective, with insurance being the commoditized transaction that gets us paid. The reality is there are issues that people are facing in their companies that are causing their premiums to be what they are. We focus on that stuff because if we don't fix that, we can't fix the premium. And I think so many people in our industry have that backwards because they focus on premium, because if you sell a policy, that's what gets you paid. That's excellent alliteration too, by the way. But all that to say, there's something to be said for understanding the contributing factors and the tactics that can be taken on the front end to mitigate a lot of this stuff. But you have to know where to even start. And I think that starts with expanding our horizons and talking to people like you who are on a different end of the general segment of that part of the business world that we're operating in right now. So what led you to where you're at right now? How did you get to be the founder of your own consulting company for cybersecurity?
It's been kind of a crazy journey. There's a lot to that. And I guess before I jump into things, I just want to comment on what you just said there too. The way I always looked at this, and the reason why a cybersecurity sales guy might talk to producers about cyber liability and these conversations is cybersecurity and cyber liability to me are two complementary solutions of the same problem. One's transferring risk, one's mitigating it, but it all has to do with cyber risk. And so regardless of what the solution is you're bringing to the table, if you're doing the right thing and engaging prospects and having these conversations on the front end, you're opening that door wider on the cyber risk. And the better you can do so and connect the dots to your solution, the more value your client finds in it. So regardless of the fact that I'm providing different solutions than a lot of your listeners, there's a lot of things I think that I've learned that hopefully can help them as they have those conversations. But I guess as far as the background, how I got here, a lot of my background's in sales and education. I have a bachelor's degree in math and originally wanted to be a teacher, but wasn't a very profitable path. And so I bounced back and forth between sales and
When are
education.
we ever going to fix that, man? Because everybody you talk to realizes teachers are underpaid, and we're all disgusted by the fact that teachers are underpaid, yet they largely remain underpaid everywhere in the country. Like that just blows my mind. They're the backbone of everything we do. If you don't have teachers, you really don't have much of anything else.
We could probably do a whole show on that right there.
I would think so, man, for sure.
It's a problem. But I think what I've seen happen is it runs a lot of really good educators out of the program, and they do things like I'm doing and go into sales and other fields that are a lot more profitable. However, I really think, especially for anybody out there that is passionate about education, I think sales is the right way to go. I describe myself as more of a consultative salesperson, so it comes in with educating my clients, helping them understand complex challenges and how to solve them with my solution. And, again, like I was saying before with the cyber conversation, that adds value to what I'm bringing to the table. But and how I got here, while I was going through school, I did do a lot of different sales stuff. I was in retail for a while. My first job out of school was at State Farm, so I got a PNC license in life and health. I only did that for a little bit, but that ended up serving me well because I ended up back at Vertafore in 2011, and the knowledge of the industry helped a little bit there. At Vertafore, that's really where I started to dial in on sales and be more focused on that career path. I did lead generation. I worked inside sales for small agencies, eventually found my way to the field sales team, working as a client partner first for account managers in this field agency side, and then became an account manager myself. So I was working with agencies in your region down in the Southeast from 75 to 200 employees in size. But Vertafore was huge. It gave me access to tons and tons of resources and training around sales, lots of mentors. I learned a ton about the industry and the technology especially. So that really served me in the cybersecurity side. I left Vertafore because I had some friends in 2017 that were starting a cybersecurity company, and I've always been really intrigued by it and was looking for something a little bit different and threw my hat in the ring to help them build their business. So in 2017, took that pivot to cybersecurity and was their director of sales for a company called Rigid Bits. We did that primarily focusing on the insurance industry because I had that background in the network there and understood insurance. I understood that agencies needed help with these resources for their clients too. So it was a important vector for us to focus on. Over that time, in 2022, we got acquired, but prior to that, over our first 4 years, just with 5 of us, we were able to work with 8 top 100 agencies and then 2 of the top 20 agency partnerships out there. And so really proud of what we built. We worked very closely with people throughout the industry, and groups like Agents Council for Technology contributed to things like their cyber guide and other resources they've had over the years. Worked with groups like different big I associations, NetView, AppliedNet, you name it. So lots of different things where we're out there presenting and talking. In 2022, got acquired by an IT company. It was their VP of sales there for a bit and helped them get the merger kind of figured out. And then did that for a year and a half until last year I decided to break off on my own. So now I'm taking all of that, the education, the cybersecurity, and providing more resources for agencies. So I have a program called securemyagency.com, where I've taken a lot of the stuff I learned in education around online learning and distance learning to help give them resources to get started down that path, or if they're more mature, help them find the right resources to continue. And then part of it, as we've been talking about, is helping people sell more cyber too. So I created sellmorecyber.com, where I've taken a lot of the things I've learned to help people ramp up faster and hopefully give them some edge as they go out there in the market and sound differently. That really started because I had agencies reaching out to me that I was helping with cybersecurity, and they appreciated the way I talked about it and the way I made it simple, and asked me to train their producers around this. So it's content that I've had for years that I've just really kind of focused on, and really over the last few months here, really have been focusing more on breathing more resources into that kind of program.
So from your perspective, you've been all on all different sides of cyber, from insurance, non-insurance, corporate, small business, all of
Mhm.
that. But specific to the insurance agency world, where are agencies missing it on cyber? Where's a disconnect for them?
Well, so it's funny because I've been presenting a lot over the years, and I still find topics that I've been talking about from the get-go are still things that are new to a lot of agencies out there. They don't know the requirements they have. A lot of them don't, funny enough, don't understand that they actually have risk in this area. They don't understand how this works. And so a lot of it is coming back in and educating them around the fact that they don't necessarily have to be a target to be attacked. They they have requirements that they have to do. And I think a lot of people just aren't sure where to start. And so they just get overwhelmed and stop. But I think some of the other side of it too is the culture. I know with the Vertivore side, there's a lot of challenges around change management and especially around the technology and the complex technology that agencies have. And so I think there's a lot of challenges around getting people to understand at a staff level or even at the leadership level, sometimes in agencies, of why this is important and how this really intertwines within the technology they use in their office. So I think it's just a matter of education. But just being in the industry for a long time, I know shifting to paper has been a big challenge for agencies, or off of paper, I should say. It's the same with cybersecurity. It's just lagging from other industries sometimes.
Yeah, no, it definitely. I mean, I think that technology in general is lagging in the insurance industry. We always seem to be the slowest to adopt and move forward, and I don't know that there's a good reason for it, to be honest with you. But talk a little bit about that educational track for producers, because I think that that's something that's important. I mean, there's very intense professional designation programs like the one that Chubb offers that takes you in a year to get that designation. Is that a good thing to have? Yeah, I'm sure it's a great thing to have. And Chubb would certainly be where I would want to go to get educated on that. But I don't think that it's realistic for every producer out there to assume, number one, they'll have that opportunity, and number two, to actually go through a year's worth of training to get a designation to be functionally literate in cybersecurity, right? Like, I don't think everybody needs to have a master's degree or a PhD. We need to be functionally literate and know the questions to ask at the point of sale, the things to recognize, and the remedies to offer in order to be effective. So, talk a little bit about how you designed your education for producers to address some of that.
Yeah, some of it is taking a step back. And I'll say, I do get a lot of questions about what the difference is between somebody like Chubb or other, company related training that people might get. And, I'm coming at it from more of a business standpoint. And so, how do we talk about cybersecurity in business terms and connect it back to the people we're probably selling to? In most of these cases, the person signing the check is not the IT director. And so, you don't need to get into the technical weeds. It can help you, and it can help you understand how to simplify that conversation. But that's where a lot of the stuff that I start with comes from. I actually have a free course people can take that is part of what I use in almost every presentation I use is simplifying that idea of what cyber risk is and how to quantify it and talk about it in business terms. So a lot of it really kind of comes down into that.
So let me ask you this, man. I mean, this is a loaded question, so dodge it however you want. Because it just literally came to my mind. But this is something that I've been talking about for a while now, and that is, how do you quantify cyber risk? How do you determine? How do you put a dollar figure to it? Because I think that that's like that's a moving target for everybody.
Mhm.
There's a product out there in the insurance industry now, and I've talked to the people that are behind it, called CyberCube,
Mhm.
which will give you a confidence rating on the limits that you're offering and how many claims would likely fall below that. But that's not something that every single agency in the country is going to be willing to invest in or be able to afford. So, how does an agent even go about figuring out what limits they should be offering somebody for cyber when it's kind of all over the place?
I mean, those are good resources that I think they can help in the sales process, but it's on the cybersecurity consulting side of it, when we want to understand somebody's risk, we go through a detailed cybersecurity risk assessment, and that term gets thrown around and misused, I'd say, by a lot of people. But this is actually a defined process that is recognized in frameworks by other consultants. And so a good risk assessment should be very thorough and measure likelihood and impact related to different areas of risk. And so going through an extensive engagement like that, you can start to quantify those things. But it's very hard, I think, to truly put a number on these things. I mentioned that, I have a background in mathematics, so I studied a lot of probability and things like that in school. And this comes back into things like expected value equations and probability. And there's so many factors that come into it. I think it's very hard to mathematically say, here's where you should land. So I think things like CyberCube and understanding past claims and representative samples can really be helpful. But I think that's one of the best ways right now is to understand what these claims look like and start to look at businesses similar to yours. But that's not necessarily the same conversation it would take somebody down to help them understand their risk first, because it needs to be more personalized. When you start showing these statistics, the first reaction a lot of people are going to say is, well, that's not like me. That's not going to happen to me, or I don't think it's going to be that bad. So you need to really find those things that are not as subjective that you can kind of, or more subjective, I should say, that you can agree on, like the impacts to my business. What is it going to mean if I'm down for a week? That's the kind of stuff that gets people thinking, I think, more. Now, find the right policy limits and stuff like that's going to be important. But I think getting the business person to understand what's at stake is the challenge for salespeople.
Yeah, and I think it's a delicate balance, man, because nobody wants to sell on fear. Nobody wants
No.
to motivate somebody to buy because they just go in and scare the living daylights out of them. Oh, you could lose everything you've worked your entire life to build, blah 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 blah. But at the same time, if somebody hasn't had an incident, there's this weird scenario where they find themselves like they feel like they're bulletproof, like it's not
Mhm.
gonna happen to them. And I think that's a really, really tough balance to play at the point of sale of creating a sense of urgency without selling on fear.
Mhm. Yeah, when that's stuff that I learned right away, and that's some of the stuff that goes into the idea of the course is some of the challenges I saw right away where either the salesperson or the client didn't want to get technical. The fear, uncertainty, and doubt, it gets overwhelming, and people either don't do anything or they're so freaked out that they really just don't know where to start with a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of misinformation that you have to battle out there. And then if you don't do it correctly, you can have IT against you and they can be an opponent. So it can be really challenging. And I think there's a lot of different ways to engage people on this, but getting into the statistics that a lot of people use, you're getting into areas where you could maybe see different side of the coin. And so a lot of times people have optimism bias. Despite any statistical evidence, they don't think this thing's going to happen to them. Same reason why people think, well, I'm a good driver, I don't need insurance. Well, there's people that could hit you. There's other things that could happen. And so what I've learned is if I'm getting some of those objections, I've probably started to pitch too soon, and I need to spend more time having conversations and educating. And so some of the things that I teach and that I use with my clients is helping them understand how you become a target. And if they're telling me they don't have a target, they're not a target, starting to ask questions, unpack how they actually got there, and peppering in education to help them understand this. Because what they don't realize is these attacks are automated, sometimes even big attacks like Colonial Pipeline. That was not targeted to them. Somebody found those credentials and was able to get in, and then they shut down the gas on the East Coast for weeks. And so those weren't targeted attacks. Those just happen to be crimes of opportunity. So what people need to understand is this is really equivalent to a technology version of somebody going through a parking lot checking car doors to see which one's open.
Yeah, that's actually a great analogy, man. I never even thought about it that way before, but that's 100% on point. And that still happens. Like it blows my mind how many people actually leave their car doors unlocked in their driveway or in front of their house. And I mean, we don't live in a horrible area by any stretch, but we're at a point now with the holidays where we've got the temporary signs up from law enforcement saying, make sure you lock your car doors. People are, going around breaking into cars or whatever. Like the fact that that sign even has to exist blows my mind. But it's no different because, to your point, people are of the mindset that it's not going to happen to me. And,
Mhm.
same thing with like multi-factor authentication. I despise it. I don't know of anybody who loves it. It's a royal pain in the butt. I feel like the only time it ever asks me for dual factor is when I'm like balancing my laptop in one hand and I'm trying to do something in the other hand. But if I'm sitting here ready for it, it doesn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't prompt me. But people know you should have that. But they allow the inconvenience of dual factor or multi-factor to outweigh the security of it, and so they don't do it.
Yeah. Things would be a lot different if we started first with security and took it away to do certain things. We'd feel really uncomfortable all of a sudden turning off MFA if we'd had it our whole lives. And so what I talk about a lot is that we're on a scale of risk. On one end, we're very efficient, one end, we're very secure. As you move across that and you go towards more security and you implement things like MFA, you're pulling away from efficiency. And so that's the trick with a lot of this and getting into the cybersecurity consulting side, what I really learned is this balance with risk tolerance and understanding that there's a lot of factors that come into play, including risks you have to take to function as a business and things like your culture as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, though, and you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about doing a cyber assessment, but
Mm.
I think a lot of times agencies specifically will make decisions without doing the right amount of research or due diligence, right? Like they're just going to make a very quick decision based on a gut feeling or whatever else instead of really drilling down to say, okay, what could happen here? And
Mhm.
I think that any agency that's listening to this right now, if all you did was think about the types of accounts that are in your book of business and the type of information that they have and what could happen if they were to get compromised as a result of something that you did, how bad would that screw things up? Like I look at it that way. I've got a decent number of Department of Defense contractors in my book of business. I think about it all the time. But I don't think that the average person that's out writing business thinks about what the real ramifications could be because it's always going to be the city of New Orleans or the city of Atlanta or Target or the Colonial Pipeline. It's never going to be me. Well, the fact of the matter is, though, you know about those things because they're big enough to make the news and it's sensationalized stories when they do. You're the target. Like we are the target and we're the ones that are getting hit every single day. It's just not newsworthy because it's not as big of an amount. But the reality is, if you think about it, if I'm going to go to if I want to break into cars and check door handles, where do I want to go? I want to go to a packed parking lot where there's a high propensity for people not to lock their doors. Come on in. Water's great in the insurance industry. There's a lot of people that, complain about this. And the ironic part about it is we're out giving this risk management and cybersecurity advice to our clients, but it's not even happening in our own kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a couple things that you said. I mean, first, doing your due diligence and understanding a strategy around where you're focusing your energy is a big part of this too. So, one of the questions I like to ask people is, what is your biggest area of risk and how do you know? I think that works really well is getting them to unpack how they got there. And the concern is, are you thorough enough in doing this to where you understand your environment and made an educated decision, or are you reacting to what's in the news or what you're afraid of or what you assume could be that? And so that'll get people thinking quite a bit. But with agencies, I think the data, they're probably one of the industries where, because of the reputation, the relationship-based nature of insurance, they're probably more worried about than others. And a lot of other businesses, they're not too worried about that data getting out. That's not affecting them directly as much as other impacts like losing a partner, projects going down, their business being stalled while they're under attack. All of those kinds of things tend to move the needle more. I'd say insurance is rare that they actually care about the data that they have and have to protect.
Yeah, again, we're supposed to be risk adverse. We're averse. We're supposed to be conservative, and yet here we are. I feel like 9 times out of 10, it's Russian roulette with.
Well, I'd say working in education, I had some stuff where I was helping teachers learn how to use online technology. And it's kind of the same, I think, here, but teachers were the worst students. And so it's not shocking, I guess, that risk managers are some of the worst with cybersecurity sometimes.
So, if you were consulting with an agency today, where's the place that you would tell them to start?
Yeah, so I always start with understanding your risk. If you think about this as your goal, where you want to be with security, your risk and understanding that well defines how well you can place where you are today on that map. So it's really hard to make decisions about which direction you need to go if you don't know where you're starting. The next part would be figuring out the road you're going to follow, would be following a framework. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I see a lot of people throw a hodgepodge approach into best practices, but I would grab a cybersecurity framework like CIS 18, Center for Internet Security Controls. These are things that experts use to guide people through this stuff. So these aren't things that you have to reinvent the wheel on. In fact, CIS 18 is all for free. So you can go out and find a lot of that stuff out there. It's just a matter of navigating through it. But based on your risks, use that framework to start to identify where to prioritize your risk mitigation and best practices. As you're doing that, you prepare for an attack. And through part of this too is as you get started, you need to understand what requirements you have, because that's kind of setting that bare minimum of what you need to make sure that you're doing. But risk is where you really need to start. You need to understand that well to begin to make decisions.
So I had a really good question. It left me for a second. It'll be back. Oh, I know what it was. So there's a lot of information out there when you go to quote cyber liability policies right now. I think almost every carrier that I'm aware of, whether they let you see it or not, has some kind of a scan that they're doing, some sort of an assessment. They're providing that back to you to use it to help guide the client at the point of sale. I feel like agencies put a false sense of security on those things, meaning
Mhm.
are they good? I don't know. I don't know if any one's better than the other one. I know that it's not a serious deep dive cyber audit by any stretch. I think it's probably a reasonable place to start, and it will give you some talking points. But I, how much stock should agencies put in the stuff that's generated by these insurtech carriers that are using it to generate quotes for cyber?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mentioned when I was talking about risk assessments, that term gets misused a bit, and that's one of the places where I do see it. And I don't think it's done unintentionally, but or intentionally, I should say. But those are helpful tools at certain points, but I think they can be misleading. To your point, I think they can be a double-edged sword. I think it can create a false sense of security or a false confidence too sometimes. So you could have somebody who comes back where, it's ripping them apart, showing a lot of red flags, and it actually has more to do with their website and the web host provider and things that they don't have any control over. So usually in these, you're just giving your email address, your web domain. There's not a whole lot you can see from that outside your website and your email hosting and things like that. Maybe you can search the dark web for some stolen credentials. So there's good stuff out there, but it doesn't tell you if they've done training for their staff or if they have MFA turned on. Critical things that you could just ask a couple questions about aren't addressed in those. And so, while I do think they're important, I think that they can be used in the sales process at the right place and time. I think it can create a problem for you. Because the other side of it too is if one comes back glowing, and that client now thinks, well, see, I didn't have any risk. I look great on this thing. It's going to hurt you the other direction. So what the other side of this too is what that's looking for are vulnerabilities or weaknesses. That in cybersecurity ties to your likelihood or probability of an attack. When we're talking probability with our prospects, we're getting into an area where they're going to have a different perspective on that. And where I like to shift the conversation is back again to impacts on the business if something goes wrong, not how it can go wrong. So I like to use those later in the conversation to that point. But I kind of compare it to the same idea as like buying a car online without ever opening the hood or starting the engine or getting behind the wheel. You have some information about it, but maybe not quite ready to make decisions yet. So I think you need to dig deeper. It's just too hard for a lot of these easy resources to go as deep as things like a cybersecurity risk assessment. I don't think we'll ever see that in the underwriting process unless AI can help us do that faster. It's an extensive process, and these all take time. So having some kind of quick scan is very helpful. You just got to be very careful with how you use it and how you talk about it.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I also don't think that insurance producers need to be doing deep dive cybersecurity
Yeah.
audits either. So, there's probably it's not really a fine line. I mean, I could see using the resources you're given to like I said before, open the conversation, ask some questions around it. But I think there's also a point too where a producer needs to step back and say, okay, this is getting a little bit deeper than what I
Yeah.
need to be getting into. That's when they reach out and call somebody like you, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And well, that's where I think a lot of this can go, because if you're talking at high level about business impacts on risk and you're getting them to understand that there's something they need to address here, when you're getting into the technical pieces, they're trying to solve things. They're ready to start looking at solutions in my mind. And so if they're getting there, I think that's where you say, let's get you insured. That way we can start protecting you while you work on these things and start to understand more about what's going on. Let's get your policy in place, because that's also going to get you in touch with our companies and our other resources where you can get help with this. But, I don't think you need to get too deep into it. And I think those assessments it can be a challenge. The other side of it too is everybody else is using those. If you want to sound different from other agencies and you want to really make a mark with your clients, I think you need to have a different conversation going out there.
So if I'm an agent and I go in and I start asking questions, what are a couple of things from a low-hanging fruit standpoint that I could ask a question around and know that I need to get somebody out that's far more qualified than what I am to come in and get involved?
Yeah, well, I think starting to understand how well they've done in gauging their risk is a good starting point there. So if they haven't done any methodical approach to that and they're just guessing where to focus time and energy, that's a good indicator that they don't probably have a good grasp on exactly what they're doing or where they're starting at again on that map. And so I think it all starts there. That's one of the first questions I'd ask is, what is your largest area of risk and how did you come to understand that? Because that's going to start to unpack a lot of things. Next, I want to start to ask about the decisions that they've made to address those. What best practices are you following? Are you making this up on your own, or do you have something that's guiding you through this? And then, understanding too how they're prepared for an incident. If my conversation with you right now was actually me calling you to tell you you had a ransomware attack, would you know what to do right now? What would you be doing? And getting them to actually kind of experience that and go through those motions is going to really help them understand some of this stuff. But I think as you kind of highlight some of these areas where maybe they're deficient in these understandings, or if they start to have questions about, well, how do I do this? How do I start to understand this better? That's where you can kind of pivot to say, it sounds like you're ready for a deeper conversation here. Let's get the right people involved in the conversation now.
Yeah, and I mean, we do this on the workers' comp side, right? We can go in, we can look at loss runs, we can see whether or not pre-injury, we can ask, do you have a pre-injury management program in place? Well, I know to ask that question if I look at the loss runs and see that there's lag time on the claims from the time that the injury happened to the time that it was reported. If it's 3 weeks, I'm going to say, hey, talk to me a little bit about your pre injury management program, waiting to hear what they say, knowing that it doesn't exist or there wouldn't be that kind of lag time. On return to work, I look for low dollar indemnity claims. And I know that if there's low dollar indemnity claims, that person missed a week of work and got paid lost time instead of us bringing that person back, which has a severely negative financial consequence on the experience mod. So I'm going to ask questions around return to work. I think that if, and this is something that I'm talking to my producers here about, but it's a question that needs to be asked on literally every single appointment we're on for the time being. And that is, describe your cyber incident response plan to me. Talk to me about what that looks like. Do you have a formal cyber incident response plan? Where did it come from? Who constructed it? How much did it cost? Like all of these things, right? Because again, when you're dealing, we're not going into Fortune 500 companies. We're going into middle market companies, which are complex, but they're not horribly complex. And they still have places where I don't want to say they cut corners, but it's not as formalized as what it is in other areas.
Mhm.
If you start going in and talking to a middle market company about a cyber incident response plan, probably 50% of the time, you're going to find they don't even have one. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to me. And so again, if you go back to what are the questions we're using to further the sales conversation with regard to workers' comp in the two examples that I gave you, what are the questions or what are the things we can say similar to that thought process with regard to cybersecurity that are going to open the door to more conversations? And I think cyber incident response is a huge one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, asking them if they have a plan on paper. If you have ransomware, you're not going to open up a PDF on your computer. And so you need to have that plan somewhere you can go grab it in an instant. The other side of it too is a lot of people that have insurance might say, well, I'm just going to call this insurance provider. I'm going to call my IT. Well, there are things that you need to do to contain that incident. IBM does a great report, the cost of a data breach every year. And in there, they show a correlation between the amount of time it takes to detect an incident and to contain it, and that have a direct correlation on the cost. And so your goal with incident response is to detect as quickly as possible and contain as quickly as possible. So even if you're planning to get your insurer involved on a claim, there are things that you need to do to isolate that issue and start to protect and preserve evidence. I think things have really changed a lot over the last 5 years or so with this. But we used to hear a lot of people have ransomware attacks and they'd say, we're trying to figure it out, but IT's already wiped and restored everything. And so they destroy all the evidence and our ability to understand how somebody was able to get in. And so I think there's more and more awareness now on the IT side, on the MSPs. They're learning more about how to react appropriately. But as the business owner and the leaders in that business, you need to know what those steps are. So I think to your point, yeah, asking about incident response and kind of having them walk through what that process looks like and how thought out it is going to really tell you how prepared they are in those areas.
What are some other areas aside from cyber incident response that we could formulate good fact-finding questions during the sales process?
Yeah, so I break it whenever I do my discovery calls, I break it into three key areas: your understanding the risks, your best practices, and that incident response piece. Kind of a fourth area, I guess, that would be really important to include there would be compliance. And so that's a big one that really can help push your deal forward a little bit more too, because you might have requirements that are driving the timeline here. And so what I think a lot of people don't realize is there's 50, all 50 states have breach notification laws. So even if you have just a handful of clients that you have data on, even your own employees, if you have a data breach, you have an obligation to the states that those people reside in to report that incident. So by law, a lot of businesses, if you have any kind of data on employees or clients, you have responsibilities to have an incident response plan. And that's something that I find really helpful to ask people about first is, before we get into this, is there any kind of compliance requirements you have? Are you aware of the 50 breach notification laws or some of these other proactive laws that you might fall under? Now, I'm being broad. If you know your industry and your market you're going into, you can educate yourself ahead of that on what kinds of things they need to be meeting. And that's going to help give you some substance to that conversation too. The rest of it's going to go into the same kind of questions I was sharing before on risks and best practices, but continuing to pull that thread as that conversation unfolds to see really how well of an understanding and how thorough of a process they have with that. And if they're kind of just going off on their own, making this up, or if they have, guidance or resources they're using to help them along that way.
I think that the average company too, and I think this is something we struggle with. I'm interested. I'm sure you see the same thing, but number one objection: oh, our IT company takes care of that, or our IT department takes care of that. And I think that, again, there's so many delicate balances we need to walk the line on as producers. We already talked about selling, on fear versus education, but I think that there's also a dance that needs to be done to make sure these companies and their IT partners, whether it be in-house or external, understand this is not an adversarial relationship.
Mhm.
This is something to help you. And God forbid you're the CTO of a company who's so arrogant that you think you've got it all figured out, and you don't recommend anything at all as far as picking up cyber coverage, and then all of a sudden you do have the breach, and you're the one who stuck your neck on the line saying, "Oh yeah, we don't need that." Listen, man, there's a whole lot of people in Tampa, Florida that didn't think their houses were going to get flooded, and then we had a 100-year flood, a month and a half ago. And guess what? A lot of people didn't have flood insurance because they thought, "Oh, it'll never happen to me." Here's what's nuts, man. I mean, I think cyber is 100% the same way as this. Even though we had the negative event, how many people do you think went out and immediately got flood insurance quotes so that if it ever happened again, that they were going to be covered? That's not how they think. They're like, "Oh no, if this is the first time in 100 years, we're good for
I
another,
got another 100.
another 100." It's not like it. Just I can't even wrap my head around the amount of risk people take, and it's not even that it's expensive to finance the risk through the purchase of an insurance policy. It blows my mind, man.
Well, you guys had two storms back to back. I mean,
And a third one that's allegedly going to dissipate before it gets to us, but the models have it coming right at us again. The one that's out there now.
yeah. Well, and that goes back again to this idea of how people look at statistics and the psychology behind how we perceive that stuff. So optimism bias is one that I talk about a lot, and I talk about it with my clients so they can understand and hopefully catch that stuff in that way of thinking and correct their mindset. But people tend to ignore statistics, or at least we want to associate ourselves with the positive statistic. If you talk about the rate of divorce, people are going to associate with the positive end of the couples that stay married, or anything like that. And so cybersecurity is the same way. So that's one of the things that I see happen is when we talk about these scams, or we talk about attacks, and we talk about chances of these things happening, we're getting into likelihood factors and these probability pieces. And those all have, in cybersecurity, that has to do with the weaknesses or these areas where you could be attacked, your vulnerabilities. And when you're talking about that, you're pointing at things that IT has set up and done. So that's a quick way to kind of get them against you, is to start talking about this first. you build rapport first by talking about the business impacts and the other things that IT's probably already aware of and worried about, and you're helping to advocate for them. And so instead of poking holes in what they're doing, talking about the importance of their role and advocating and working together to address these things, and how insurance and all these other resources they're going to get access to through working with your companies is going to help that IT person do better too. So I think you have to be very careful and tread carefully to make sure that you're setting up the IT person to be more of the hero there. But one quick thing that I can tell right away if it's a challenge here, if there's overconfidence in IT, is the best mindsets around all of this will tell me I don't know what I don't know, and that scares me. And they're always interested in trying to understand that other area of risk that they're missing. What's new? What's next? And if they have that comment, that's usually a good sign right at the beginning that they have the right mindset for it.
I think that's an extremely important thing to talk about. And from a producer standpoint, guys, this is something that I've mentioned before. It's why I like to network with salespeople at the companies I'm prospecting, because there is no better source of intel on how to sell leadership than salespeople who work for that same leadership. I
Mhm.
think it's the same thing with some of the IT people. And if you play your cards right, I'm not necessarily saying it's good cop, bad cop, but I don't think it's off sides to say, hey, are there any IT initiatives that concern you right now that you're having a hard time pushing through at the executive level? Because as a producer or a risk management consultant or whatever your role is, you may have an executive's ear that will actually pay more attention to you as an outside party than they will their inside technology people. And I would think that if I was going to try and get on common ground with somebody really quickly, that would be how I would do it. Tell me a problem you're facing that you've tried to solve, that you're having resistance come back to you from the leadership team, and why do you think that is? How can I help you? And
Yeah.
I think a
I
lot of
think
the
that's
times you're going to get, I think they're going to appreciate the fact you're willing to help them. I think, maybe the jury's out as to whether, how vulnerable they'll actually be with you. But I think that's really, really important, because I've seen a lot of deals get squashed because of IT departments who have convinced whoever the decision maker is procuring insurance that they've got everything handled, and, we don't really need to spend any more money.
yeah. Well, and again, because it's probably putting them in a position where they feel like this is making them look bad, that this is needed because they're not doing their job. So you need to disassociate that. Part of it's advocating for them too and helping those other executives understand. Like we want to make sure that all of this person's hard work is not for nothing, because even as hard as they're working with these things, these attacks can still happen. You can have MFA in place and you can still get by. So that's important, but we need to still protect ourselves. I think talking to IT is really beneficial. And of course, with what I'm doing, being more on the cybersecurity side, that I do get more engaged in. But having that understanding does two different things. One, it can help you understand what you're getting into as far as, especially if IT is trying to push these other initiatives and they're not getting approved. You know, if you're going to have a battle on your hands trying to get this deal through yourself. And then secondly, when you can identify other initiatives, that's going to be really important to connect the dots to them. Because if all you're doing is talking to these executives about cyber risk and avoiding attacks, and you don't have the ability to hitch the value in your solution to these other initiatives and priorities that they have, they're going to walk back out of that room with the same thing that was on their mind before they walked in. They're more worried about, this partnership they're working on, growing the business, whatever it might be. You need to connect the dots back to that, or that executive's not going to give this a second thought. You need to hitch onto those other ideas, or they'll be forgotten once they walk out of that room. So having the IT initiatives can really help.
We've been going almost 45 minutes, man. What have we left? What have we missed? What have we left out that we need to make sure everybody hears?
Well, one thing I wanted to mention too, I guess there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I have a bit of a personal vendetta against some of that because of my background in math. But the one stat that I hear people misuse all the time is that 60% of businesses go out of business within 6 months of an attack, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. And a lot of people grab that because it's great for marketing, but it's completely false and was never actually part of any report. So I think,
I don't, I think I can say very confidently I've never used that stat before, but
I say all this because I did, and I was really embarrassed when
yeah.
one of my earlier presentations I did, I had that in there and I was updating it, trying to find the source for this thing. And I dug all over the internet, couldn't find it until I started searching deep enough. I found articles from who was supposedly saying that, saying, hey, we had nothing to do with this. And now there's been all this stuff out. There's press releases and all kinds of things trying to debunk that. And I still see that stat every week almost. I see somebody using it in a sales conversation or something. So there's a lot of misinformation. So I encourage people to really take that kind of stuff carefully and grab statistics and make sure that you understand where they come from. Um, there was one other thing that I thought might be interesting to kind of get into if you want to, given
Sure.
time, is some of the things that helped me as I got started was understanding what I call the buyer criteria here. So when we started running into a lot of objections, we started to walk back and think about what's the thought process I would need to go through as a business owner to invest in this. And so there's a few, like five or six things that I keep in mind as I go through conversations with people. And if I haven't satisfied all of these, I'm not really in a position where I feel like I've earned the place to pitch yet. So first, I need the client to understand that there's high impact if something should happen to them. They need to understand what that's going to mean for their business. They also need to understand that the likelihood's growing. And assuming I'm picking prospects that are in the right area where these are all applicable, but they need to understand that the probability of this is serious and that they need to do something. They need to have that reason to change now and reason to change what they're doing. So they need that fire underneath them to make that change. They also need to understand that there's urgency there. Otherwise, my deal's going to be going on forever too. So I need them to understand we need to take action now because our risk's increasing. And if we don't do something, we're more likely to have an attack. And then they have to, of course, find value in our solution and then make sure that we're the right people for that solution. But if I've found that if I don't have those things that I can check the box on, and I'm talking to a prospect and I don't feel like they're agreeing with me on my perspective with this stuff, then I have more work to do. So I thought that might be helpful to kind of share out there as well too.
Good deal, man. No, I agree. I think the misinformation piece, how do we get around that with the internet? I mean, literally, you can find any information to prove any point you want to make at some point or another, just if you dig deep enough. I guess maybe the better question is, what are a couple of trusted resources that
Mm.
that producers can go look at that you could endorse to say you're going to get good information here. You don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I think absolutely any company reports on stats around this claims and things like that are always going to be helpful because they're working with real evidence and information. Industry reports that I really like are Verizon's data breach investigation report. They do that every year and it breaks it out by industry. So it's very good if you're picking different verticals to focus on. You want to understand the attacks in those areas and what kind of statistics Verizon's seeing there. Another one is cost of a data breach I mentioned earlier with IBM and Ponemon. That one is updated every year, and that gives a lot of insight into, I think, things that would really help with cyber liability is understanding what those factors are that relate to costs. And that report does a great job of showing how certain practices can make an impact on that cost too. So it'll give you some ideas of things that you can start doing to reduce the possible impact of a breach. Those are the two big ones I go to. There's a number of others out there that Ponemon usually has to do with. They do a lot of cybersecurity reports and investigations. But I would just make sure that with all of that out there, if you see a statistic, try to find the source, the report that generated that, because it's going to talk about the methodology used and it's going to give you something to point back to. I would also just caution people with using that stuff too. I use statistics to reinforce things that we've had conversations about. I don't use the statistics to say, here's the situation. So I tend not to use them as much in marketing, as much of after a conversation to say, we talked about these practices you're missing. You can see why in other businesses this has been a problem for them. This is what cost of data breach is showing that these things that you're missing can do to your impact. And so I use those more to prove a point than necessary to open the door in prospecting. So hopefully that helps too.
Got it. No, that makes perfect sense. Well, how do they find you, man? Before we wrap up, what's the easiest way to connect with you? Obviously, I mentioned that we're connected on LinkedIn, but is there a preferred method?
Yeah, probably easiest way is sellmorecyber.com. That's where I have resources and information about the program I have for producers. You can learn more about RLS Consulting through there. I also have securemyagency.com. So if you're, depending on whether you're looking for yourself or for your office, there's a lot there. I do have a lot more stuff coming. I have more and more resources I'm putting out there for producers, but I'm working on more general business resources as well too. So more things to partner with agencies on as we go. And yeah, that'd be the first place I'd go to, sellmorecyber.com.
Awesome. Sounds good, man. Well, listen, I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join me today.
Yeah.
definitely good conversation, man. All kinds of stuff covered. And certainly if you're a producer and we're paying attention to this, you picked up a few little nuggets you can use out on the road this next week. So I challenge you to do that. And when you do and it works, send me a message so I can let Ryan know, because that's why we bring guys like Ryan on here. So
Yeah,
thanks
please
so
do.
much again, Ryan, for jumping on, and everybody else, we'll catch you next time. See ya.